Hello to everyone. Welcome to Putting on the Mind of Christ. You are loved with an everlasting love. This is your Pastor Yati. Today I'm going to talk about the kingdom of heaven, the highest level of human consciousness. I hope all is well with all of you and enjoying and learning a lot from this in-depth study. The inner work of Christ, the inner work of Christianity. The kingdom of heaven is non-dual consciousness, the highest level of human consciousness. There are many different levels of human consciousness. Swiss developmental psychologist Jean Piaget, 1896 to 1980, who was a professor of child psychology at the University of Geneva. From 1929 until his death, was a pioneer in the study of the developing consciousness of children. His writings included the child's conception of the world, the moral judgment of the child, and the language and thought of the child. Contemporary American philosopher, psychologist, and mystic Ken Wilber is the author of even a dozen books on the development of human consciousness, including The Spectrum of Consciousness, Sex, Ecology, and Spirituality, and Up from Eden. The non-dual consciousness, that is, the vision of the kingdom of heaven, is the highest stage in the growth of human consciousness, from infancy to full spiritual maturity. By the process of inner growth in spiritual awareness, a path of constant inner realization, who gradually come to see our own union with God in Christ, so that at the final stage of non-dual awareness, God alone and His kingdom remain. We see, when we realize the vision of the kingdom of heaven, that we, like Christ, are not mere human beings after all, but are now and have always been nothing else than immortal, unlimited divine spirit. In his ministry, Jesus wanted more than anything else to tell us about the non-dual vision of the kingdom he saw. He saw a kingdom right here on earth, in which everyone was truly and substantially one with God and one with each other. At the same time, however, he saw that this non-dual oneness didn't take away from God's transcendence or from our own humanness or individuality. To our human minds, this sounds like a paradox. How can we be God, be one divine, and yet God remain transcendent, and we remain human and individual? But Jesus' non-dual vision of the kingdom of heaven was not a paradox. It only seems like a paradox to our limited logical way of thinking. Jesus' non-dual vision was simply the seeing of what, in fact, is actually true. Jesus, however, found it impossible to describe his non-dual vision in simply declarative sentences without sounding paradoxical. That is because the human mind and the declarative space-time language that our human minds have created is itself dualistic. Our mind, and therefore human language, are inherently structured on the basis of countless space-time logical, polar opposites. Jesus did not say, the kingdom of heaven is this, because this automatically includes its opposite, that. Nor did he say, the kingdom of heaven is that, because that automatically excludes its opposite, this. He did not say, the kingdom is here, because here excludes its opposite, there. Likewise, he did not say, the kingdom is there, because there excludes its logical opposite, here. So Jesus ended up saying that the kingdom was not here and not there. Luke 17, verse 21. Still another way Jesus got around the problem of declarative or logical language was to speak about his inner non-dual vision of the kingdom in parables, analogies, metaphors, and stories. This got around the problem of logic, but made his words less clear. That left him open to constant misunderstandings on the part of the Pharisees and millions even today, who cannot understand any truth unless it can be expressed in logical black versus white terms. Besides this difficulty of expression, however, there is a second problem that was faced by Jesus and, since Jesus, by those Christian saints, some of whom have been called mystics, who have followed him into the kingdom, even when the vision of the kingdom of heaven is clearly expressed in poetic or metaphorical language. Readers or listeners are still going to be unable to clearly understand that vision unless they too have already realized non-dual consciousness. That is because we cannot understand a level of consciousness above our own by simply reading or listening to the words to someone else's description of that level. To clearly understand a level of consciousness, we actually have to live at that level ourselves and see the world from that level ourselves. This problem of understanding the words of persons at higher levels of awareness is why most Christian theologians, preachers, and church leaders have such a hard time, if not an impossible one, trying to interrupt the Christian mystics or trying to compare, not to interrupt, interpreted the Christian mystics, or trying to compare the Christian mystics of those of other religions. They constantly misunderstand and misinterpret these mystics because they themselves do not have a high enough level of spiritual consciousness to see what the mystics are talking about. Even more importantly, it is why, after 2,000 years, most of these theologians, preachers, and church leaders still do not understand Jesus and his kingdom. Let me try to show the chasm or space between different levels of consciousness and how persons at different levels actually see this world differently by citing examples of a child's growth in consciousness from one level to another. The examples based on the work of the renowned child psychologist Jean Piaget are taken from books by philosopher-psychologist Ken Wilber. Here is an example involving a glass of water and a second, taller, empty glass. And I recite Wilber's rights. If you take very young children and right in front of their eyes, pour the water from a short glass into a tall glass and ask them which glass has more water. They will always say the tall glass has more, even though they saw you pour the same amount from one glass to the other. They cannot conserve volume. Certain obvious things that we see, they do not and cannot see. They live in a different world place, in a world space. No matter how many times you pour the same amount of water back and forth between the two glasses, they will not insist the tall glass has more. They will insist. Excuse me. They will insist the tall glass has more. If a few years later you repeat the experiment, the kids will always say that both glasses have the same amount of water. They can hold volume in their mind and not be confused by its displacements. They have an internal rule that automatically does this, and if you show them a videotape from the earlier period, they will deny it's them. They think you've doctored the videotape. They simply cannot imagine somebody being so stupid as to think the tall glass has more water. And here is a second example. 3 children of different ages are given the same test. One child, the youngest, still thinks in a magical way and has not yet developed thinking skills. Piaget calls this child pre-op, meaning the stage just prior to or pre. The ability to the mental operations. The second youngest child, whom Piaget calls conop or conop, has learned to think, but only in concrete ways. The child still can't handle abstract concepts and principles. The third and oldest child, an adolescent whom Piaget calls form-up, can think abstractly and understand universal principles, can do formal mental operations. All 3 children are separately presented with 5 glasses that contain colorless liquids. 3 of the glasses contain liquids that, if mixed together, will produce a yellow color. The children are asked to produce a yellow color. The pre-op child, the child with the lowest level of consciousness, will randomly combine a few glasses, then give up. If she accidentally hits upon the right solution, she will give a magical explanation. The sun made it happen. It came from the clouds. The conop child, a child with concrete mental consciousness, will eagerly begin by combining the various glasses, 3 at a time. She does this concretely. She will simply continue the concrete mixing until she hits upon the right solution, or eventually gets tired and quits. The form-up adolescent, the child with abstract mental consciousness, will begin by telling you have to try all the possible combinations of 3 glasses. She has a mental plan or formal operation that lets her see, however vaguely, that all possible combinations have to be tried. She doesn't have to stumble through the actual operations to understand this. Rather, she sees with the mind's eye that all possibilities must be taken into account. You will notice in the above examples I just gave that the information given to each of 3 children is the same. All the physical parts of the experiment are identical, and all 3 children heard the same words. It was the children's degree of inner understanding or consciousness that was different. An understanding, as the example shows, that normally progresses in an evolutionary or developmental way as the child grows in age. Only the child with the highest level of consciousness was able to solve the problem. The same thing occurs among Christians, even among those who faithfully read and meditate on the Bible or study the mysteries set out in Christian creed, some depending upon how spiritually developed their awareness is, understand more than others. It is the degree of inner understanding, the level of consciousness, not the assumed meaning of the words information, that counts. St. Augustine, making this point, said that the other meaning of scriptures was the silver, but the inner meaning of the scriptures was the gold. Saint Therese of Lisieux, 1873-1897, to give just one example of continually consciousness growth at even a high stage of spiritual development, said she was forever getting new insights and understandings from the scriptures as her inner awareness continued to grow. There will be no for us to truly seek the kingdom if we assume, as some Christians apparently do, that we already fully understand Jesus, the Gospels, and the Creed. We don't. With respect to Jesus, how many times have we heard people say, for example, filmmakers who make movies about Jesus, or theologians who write about him, that Jesus was a human being just like us, so therefore he must have thought in this or that way, usually meaning with the same level of consciousness as the filmmaker or theologian. Such filmmakers and theologians don't understand that there are different levels of human consciousness. And truly, Jesus was a human being like us. But though he perhaps knew less than 1/10 of the information possessed by a college student today, his level of consciousness far exceeded that of today's greatest but merely intellectual geniuses. So this discussion, and I hope you bear with me, I hope gives us an idea of how hard it was for Jesus to make himself understood by the lower conscious Jewish priests and lay preachers. He even had problems being understood by his own disciples, though the disciples, poor fishermen, as most of them were themselves great souls who came to earth to help Jesus in his mission. That the fishermen Jesus chose to be his disciples were advantaged in awareness is shown by many gospel passages. When Jesus asked the disciples, "Who do you say I am?" Simon Peter answered, "You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God." And Jesus then responded, "This truth did not come to you from any human being, but it was given to you directly by my Father in heaven." Matthew 16:15-17. What this exchange shows is that Simon Peter, though an uneducated fisherman, was spiritually, consciously evolved enough to be not only open to the voice of the Father within himself, but also accurately receptive to the inner messages of the Father. The consciousness of Simon Peter, therefore, was at least at the level of the psychic consciousness, and probably higher, And see also Matthew 14:29. For Simon Peter's initial success at walking on water. Similarly, all of the disciples, even during Jesus' ministry, were sent by Jesus to heal people and cast out the emotional or mental illnesses called demons. Luke 9:1-6. They could not have been successful in this had they not attained at the least the psychic level of awareness. When Jesus preached to the multitude, he was like the older or oldest child in the examples earlier, trying to convince the younger child or children of the truth. One, the younger ones found it impossible to consciously see, nor would Jesus have it much easier if he came to teach among Christians today. The vast majority of us, including our Christian leaders, can't see the inner kingdom of heaven now any more than the Pharisees and Jewish people were able to see it then. Jesus, who thought and saw at the very highest level of consciousness, the non-dual level, was constantly aware of this problem. Again and again, he talked about people who had ears to hear but could not hear, and eyes to see but could not see. Matthew 13, verses 13 and 15. Similarly, he talked about the blind leading the blind. Matthew 15, verse 14. It is why he expressed himself one way for the general public in parables, and more explicitly in private to the more spiritually advantaged disciples. Even the disciples were often unable to see and understand. Apparently, it was only during the inner spiritual events we commemorate at Pentecost that the disciples' eyes were fully opened and they at last completely understood. The communications barrier for Jesus and those saints, we have realized the non-dual awareness of the kingdom of heaven as being a terrible problem, because the gap between non-dual consciousness of the kingdom and the consciousness of the ordinary Christian or church official is enormous. It is a vastly wider gap than that between the children in the examples cited earlier. Many saints solve this problem by not even trying to express the vision of kingdom in words. They stay silent, content to be rather than to speak. Or words, mystic, comes from the Greek verb muo, which means I am silent. Saint Therese of Lisieux, though she did in the end write an autobiography, summarized her spiritual realizations by saying she had learned that my vocation is to be love. Other saints have concentrated on privately teaching a small group of intimate students following Jesus, examples of giving special and to us secret instructions to his disciples. Finally, a few mystics have tried to express the vision of the kingdom in words, and, like Jesus himself, some have found themselves in serious trouble with the religious authorities for doing so. Some genuine Christian saints have gotten the same treatment from Christian church officials that Jesus got from the Pharisees and Sadducees. Over the centuries, many were condemned, and some were even put to death. Probably the clearest written account of the non-dual vision from a Christian saint is contained in the writings of the medieval Dominican priest Meister Eckhart, a successor to St. Thomas Aquinas in the chair of the theology at the University of Paris. Unfortunately, some of his writings taken out of context and, as usual, misunderstood by cardinals and other church leaders were condemned. Nor because of this condemnation has he ever been officially recognized as a saint. Meister Eckhart is still not understood even by theologians who have themselves not entered the kingdom. The theologian and professor of historical theology Bernard McGinn calls Eckhart ever elusive. McGinn has done a first-rate job in editing for the Classics of Western Spirituality series, 2 volumes on Eckhart, the first with Edmund College, and the second volume, Meister Eckhart, Teacher and Preacher. He selected a number of Eckhart's works for inclusion, noting that each of these illustrations one or more of the most essential themes of Eckhart's speculative thoughts. In calling Eckhart's thought speculative, McGinn apparently assumes that Eckhart's level of consciousness is the same as that of the most theologians' rational level, and that Eckhart's theology, which he also calls difficult, might be laid bare by more scholarly study. But Eckhart's thought, for the most part, is not speculative. Eckhart is not doing theological theorizing. He is simply reporting and describing the world as he sees it at the level of non-dual consciousness. The level of kingdom of heaven, there is only one way to understand Eckhart, to go within oneself until one too can see the world as Eckhart. And Jesus saw it. We will hear more about Meister Eckhart and later as we develop this study. My point in this chapter is to clearly point out that there are different levels of human consciousness, different levels of spiritual understanding, and that the non-dual vision of the kingdom of heaven is the highest level. There may be some who will say that these assertions about different levels of awareness or consciousness are the type of Gnosticism, the schools of thought that held it took a special knowingness to fully understand Jesus and the scriptures. That's Gnosticism. That was rejected by the church in the early Christian era. They are not. While I agree with the Gnostics that it takes a high level of knowingness, consciousness, to understand Jesus as the scriptures, I reject those Gnostics' belief that were rejected by the early church, such as the idea that matter is evil, that Jesus was not truly human, that Jesus didn't have a human body, that creation was a falling away from grace into matter, that Satan is an evil God co-equal with the God who is good, and etc. I reject that. If the idea of levels of human awareness or knowingness per se were heretical, then we could have to classify as heretics all developmental psychologists and the entire Christian tradition of spiritual writers from Saint Dionysius, circa AD 500, to Saint John of the Cross, the 16th century, to the 20th century's Evelyn Underhill, all of whom recognizes developmental stages of spiritual awareness through which the Christian must pass on the way to realization of union with God. Even in our own society, it is still not generally understood that people, except perhaps children, have different levels of awareness, though many transpersonal and other pioneering psychologists now know differently. Most politicians and other societal leaders generally assume that everyone has the same level of consciousness. This is a dangerous assumption given the life and death urgency of many problems facing the human race. Some social leaders think that the information superhighway of the Internet's World Wide Web will save the world because everyone will have more and more information with which to make enlightening choices. A few hours wandering through virtual chat rooms, where discussions are often little more than schoolyard brawls, should be enough to convince most people that information alone will do nothing to improve the human race if the level of human consciousness and spiritual understanding does not grow. In fact, superior information or technology in the hands of spiritual in development persons is generally a dangerous thing. To give one example, consider Hitler's use of the radio, by which he used the new technology to stir up and control the German masses with his mesmerizing, spellbinding speeches. It is essential, therefore, even from a secular perspective, that people be assisted not just in getting more information, but in moving to higher and higher, or deeper and deeper, of one prefers, levels of inner personal awareness. This is especially important for the Christian Church. It is vitally important because the only essential purpose of religion is to accelerate growth in consciousness. People do not need religion to develop laws or ethical approaches to problems. Legislatures, courts, and ethical experts drawn from the various professions can do that. Nor do they need religion to operate hospitals, soup kitchens, school, and social welfare programs. Government and private charities can do that. People do not even need religion to grow in spiritual awareness. They can and do grow in spiritual consciousness by learning from the wealth of experience, often difficult and challenging ones, that life brings them. What people need religion for is to accelerate growth in consciousness, to speed up our normal snail's pace growth in spiritual awareness. All the technologies of the Christian religion, the New Testament, prayer, Bible, study, preaching, fasting, music, Holy Communion or Mass, healing services, chanting, rituals, almsgiving, monasteries, convents, pilgrimage, meditations, icons, and sacraments have only one purpose: to accelerate people's growth and consciousness upward and eventually into the non-dual vision of Jesus' kingdom. In the past, at least, the church technologies have usually been essential for a Christian to realize the kingdom of heaven in his or her lifetime. Christians would benefit enormously if our contemporary Christian leaders were able to skillfully and knowledgeably assist them in attaining high levels of awareness. Isn't that more important than spending enormous amounts of time, energy, and money on politics, social work, or even ethics? In addition, many contemporary Christian leaders, sometimes even consciously and often because they themselves feel inadequate to the task, have been doing over the essential spiritual work of religion, the healing and growth of consciousness, to psychiatry and psychology. This is not only an abdication of religion's reason for being, but at the present time is often a serious practical error.
Okay, I found this on the web for a serious practical error. Check it out.
Many, if not most, contemporary psychiatrists and psychologists erroneously believe the human mind and spirit can be reduced to and explained by biochemistry. Others make a god of the ego, and still others strive to help the patient adapt to a society that is itself unbalanced. Whatever their many legitimate achievements, these sciences are not yet developed enough to be entrusted with the sacred task of healing the consciousness of Christians and raising them beyond materialism and rationalism in the kingdom. The church, unless it is content to lose its reason to exist, must be the principal means that Christians can use to accelerate their growth in consciousness to Jesus' inner kingdom. Otherwise, Christians, seeing that the salt has lost its favor, will go elsewhere, as in millions of instances they are already doing. Christians are in as much need of genuine spirituality today as ever in the past. Only a reconcentration of the church on its essential spiritual mission can provide Christians with the spiritual food they desperately seek. I turn now to the question of mapping the path to Jesus' inner kingdom of heaven. But that's for another time. Interesting, right? And I think not easy. Well, maybe it's good that you experience or search for those people I mentioned in this study. Especially Meister Eckhart, St. John of the Cross. I think Hildegard von Bingen They're all mystics. They understood the high level of consciousness. They saw the vision of the kingdom. And so many more. But anyway, try to go through this, even it's a well-fed inside study. Pray over it. And as you read scripture, pray over scripture. Ask God. God will not let you out. So, I wish you a very wonderful, interesting, inspired day. May God bless you and protect you. And may His light shine over you, wherever you go. God is with you, and the peace of God be with you. This is your Pastor Yeti. Bye-bye.